Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the HR Leaders Podcast, a show where we explore the future of work with industry experts and HR executives from the world's leading global brands. Today we have a special guest on the show for you today. We're joined by Alex Edmans, who's a professor of finance at the London Business School and author of the best-selling book, Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. How are you doing, Alex?
Great, thanks. It's really good to be on the show, Chris.
Nice to see you. It's always good when I love actually when I come across a TED talk or including your own and other work, and I get to finally have you on the show. So thank you so much for all the work you've been doing. First and foremost, definitely learned a lot from my side. And let's talk more about the book. I think, did you launch the book during the pandemic actually? Was it, or just before?
Yeah, so the launch date was like the end of March last year.
Oh,
so when
no.
the pandemic happened, I was like crestfallen that all of the launch events were cancelled. But then I thought, well, it's been really selfish for me to be crestfallen because like I'm really not affected by the pandemic compared to people who actually physically go to work. So yeah, the pandemic's been a shame, but like I'm not affected so much by it.
Yeah, fair enough. Tell everyone, before we go any further, tell everyone a little bit more about yourself personally and your background and journey to where we are now.
Absolutely. So right now I'm a professor of finance at London Business School, but I started off doing investment banking at Morgan Stanley, and I did that for a couple of years, and I actually got treated really well. So you've got a lot of ex-investment bankers who worked really hard, but I actually I thought it was a great job to have where you work on really difficult problems with smart people, but I felt that I would work on one company's problems for maybe 1 year when they were doing a merger or something. Whereas as a professor, if you write something that could be timeless and that could apply to many companies and many industries. So I left to do a PhD at MIT in Boston, the US, then was a professor at Wharton for 6 years. And then after getting tenure, I moved back to London in 2013 to be at London Business School. And why? It's because out of the spectrum of professors, I'm very much on the practitioner side rather than the purely academic side. And Wharton's a great school, but it's in Philadelphia, which is neither New York nor Washington, D.C. So you weren't as involved in the real world. But coming to London, and I never knew that purpose would become such a topical issue, but it's great to be able to talk on these issues with practitioners. And that's why it's great to do interviews like this one.
Mm-hmm. As part of the way your role now is that you get to see your projects come to life as well, because I know a lot of the practitioners that I speak to that go into the academic world, one of the things they miss is seeing the work come to life in those organizations and seeing the change take place.
Yeah, so I really like the fact that like when you do research and it's probably like takes sometimes 5 years to write a paper and make it really rigorous. You hope that after those 5 years of work, it doesn't just get sat in a library and make an impact only in academic circles, but it affects the way that people think and act. And so the fact that a lot of companies and investors are now taking purpose seriously, clearly that's not just down to my work. There's a lot of people working in the space,
of course,
but that there are some who have taken specific ideas that I focused on, and that is very gratifying.
Yeah. So why Grow the Pie? You know, what was the inspiration behind writing this book? And tell us what was the inspiration behind the name as well?
Yeah, so let me explain what I mean by the pie. So we often think that the value that a company creates is given by a pie, and that pie can be given either to investors in the form of profits or society in the form of value. So let's say wages to workers or fair prices to customers or taxes to the government. And often a business leader thinks that her goal is to make as much money as possible to maximize shareholder value. And if the pie is fixed, the only way to increase your slice of the pie is to reduce the slice given to others. And so unfortunately, there are some leaders who try and pay their workers as little as possible or pollute the environment. But the whole idea of growing the pie is to highlight that the relationship between business and society is not a zero-sum game. Actually, the better way to profit is by creating value for wider society, perhaps by providing employees with a healthy and enriching place to work or launching new products that genuinely solve social problems, and then profit is a byproduct of that. And I think this is important because this means that the whole idea of purpose is really central to a business. So for too long, people have thought that purpose is an optional extra. It's something that's at the expense of profit, so let's do it to the minimum possible. But actually, if being a purposeful business means that not only do you create more value for society, but the company is also more successful in the long term, then it's something that every business leader needs to take seriously and make it front and center of her business.
Mm-hmm. Just out of curiosity, how do you define purpose?
So I would say purpose is the role the business plays in the world. It's why it exists. And I think that's really important because it means that purpose has to be focused and targeted. So some people use purpose as a synonym for altruism, right? A personal company needs to serve customers, workers, the environment, and so on. So when there is a critical social issue, like say Mr. Floyd is killed, then companies think, oh, to be purposeful, I need to post a black square and I need to donate money to Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm clearly someone who cares a lot about racial equality, but that is not every company's purpose, because if your goal is to, let's say, use technology to launch financial inclusion in Kenya, which is what Vodafone did with M-Pesa, maybe it's best for you to focus your efforts on that rather than something which is not related to your expertise. So a purposeful company needs to be focused and targeted. Yes, you should serve society, but it's not your responsibility to solve all of the world's problems. Just like a doctor might not also want to be a lawyer and an entrepreneur and work in a soup kitchen, she should just focus on her medical ability and do that really well. And that's the same for a company.
Yeah. No, yeah, it makes complete sense. Could you share some examples of companies that have done this well, balancing both purpose and profit?
Yeah, so let me go back to Vodafone and let me give you a little bit more context. So around sort of 2005, Vodafone's strategy was to focus on the West because that's where the market was most developed, and to win spectrum license auctions in the West. So had it been purely focused on profit, it would have done only that. However, within Vodafone, there was also this small unit, which is about what are the social challenges that we can solve with our technology beyond just running mobile phone services. And what they realized was that in Kenya, 15 million people had no access to the banking system. They were relying on cash, which is dangerous because it can be forged or stolen. And they launched M-Pesa, which is a way of transferring money on their phones without needing to use cash. And that's something which, yes, it did solve a big social problem. And there were studies showing that within 7 years, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty. But also, it was profitable to Vodafone because later on down the line, it was able to monetize it. Now, let me be clear. It didn't launch it thinking, oh, we can make money out of it. Because if their goal was to make money, focus on the West, because that's where there's most lucrative market. But it was said first, what is a social problem that we can solve with our technology? And given that this was something linked to their expertise, they were able to monetize it because it was linked to what they were good at.
Mm-hmm. So do you need to have a thought? Obviously going in, they weren't planning on making profit for it. Is that a mistake that companies make, or should you be intentional about balancing both and seeing the fact that, oh, there is an opportunity to make revenue? Vodafone didn't know that, and it kind of happened longer term. But do you think companies should intentionally have a plan to make profit whilst delivering purpose to wider society or adding value?
I don't think so. I think it's important to lead with purpose, and that might seem heretical for a finance professor to say don't think about profit. But I think the problem about leading every decision with profit is that it's really hard to calculate the impact that a decision might have on profits. So yes, if I was to make an investment in a factory, I would assess it on the profit potential. I could calculate how many widgets I could sell and how much I would be able to monetize this for. But let's think about if I was to give my employees more parental leave, then I've got some sense that they might be more productive and more motivated, but I can never calculate that. So if I had to base every decision on a profit calculation, there would be many investments that I would not take. And similarly for Vodafone, would they be able to monetize it? Well, in Kenya back then, where there was not so much affluence, so how much they'd pay for it would be probably small, and maybe they would have never known what the uptake would have been because mobile usage was relatively low. So I think it's the idea of starting with purpose is much more powerful. And just to give one final analogy, in our lives, we probably know of generous people and selfish people. And selfish people, they will help you, but they'll help you if they think they can get something down the line. Right? They'll help somebody if they think you're influential, they can call them a favor later. But there is research on this idea of pro-social behavior that actually generous people become more successful in the long term because unexpectedly, a good turn that they did gets repaid in the future, even though they could have never predicted that. And that's the same idea about a purposeful business. Lead with purpose, and then the profits will follow. And then my role as a finance professor is to show this rigorously with data, so it's not just wishful thinking.
Mm-hmm. Which is kind of, yeah, what it is at the moment is pretty much wishful thinking in many organizations. So how do companies be more, not to use the same word, purposeful about doing this and actually bringing this into reality? What are some practical steps and things that companies can do?
I think an important first practical step is to define what your company's purpose is. And virtually every company around the world has a purpose statement, but many of these are pretty vacuous. Why? Because many of them are not focused and targeted. They might say, our purpose is to serve customers, employees, the environment, and shareholders and suppliers. But that means nothing, because that means it's all things to all people. It doesn't guide you in making decisions. Whereas if you're Vodafone, where their purpose is to use our technology to enhance socio-economic progress, that's focused and targeted. That doesn't say anything about climate change, even though that's obviously a big problem. And that's not to say Vodafone is going to ignore it, climate change, but it means that the first thing that's going to drive most of its decisions is using technology. And if there are indeed uses of technology that enhance socio-economic progress, even if there is not a clear profit coming out of it, it will still do it because it's consistent with the purpose. So I'd say first, define your purpose. And then number two, think about how you're going to measure whether the purpose is put into practice. So there is a bank I know in Asia which tries to measure the number of business customers it gives a loan to who have never received a business loan before. So if their purpose is to provide financial inclusion, is to allow companies to make investments they wouldn't otherwise do, let's try to measure something like that. Mm-hmm. And so people often have this phrase sort of, what gets measured gets done. And if you indeed are serious about improving access to finance, you need to make sure that this is something that's measured, because then are you actually achieving your purpose? Yeah.
What are the biggest challenges that you see that companies face in balancing purpose and profit?
So I think one big challenge is the recognition is actually thinking that purpose is at the expense of profit. So there are many business leaders who might think, okay, this purpose stuff, it's just it's fluffy and tree cargy. My goal is to make money. But
is that what you mean, by the way, by the pie splitting mentality? Is that what
exactly. It's the view that anything that we give to shareholders is at the expense of stakeholders. And so that's why a lot of my work is to try to highlight actually the pie growing mentality is something supported by evidence. It's not too good to be true. So I come to this as a hard-hearted finance professor and ex-investment banker and saying, well, even if your goal is to make your company profitable in the long term, you should take purpose seriously. So I think first challenge is mentality. The second challenge is time horizons. Let's say you're a CEO and you believe everything I've said, that the pie can be grown, that purpose leads to profit in the long term. The caveat is this is only true in the long term. In the short term, purposeful behavior isn't profitable. So to launch M-Pesa costs a lot of money. To give your employees parental leave also costs money. And so if CEOs are compensated according to quarterly earnings targets, they're not going to be thinking about the long term.
That's a big problem, isn't it?
Important is just the change and the incentive horizons of CEOs. So one thing that I've been really behind in the UK with UK policymakers is to extend the horizons over which CEOs are being paid. And in 2018, the UK Corporate Governance Code extended the minimum holding period from 3 years to 5 years, which I think is really good because it gives them this longer term perspective. And the third and final thing I'll say, in terms of the barriers, is leaders not realizing that purpose does mean that you can be focused and targeted. So some leaders think, I need to solve all of the world's problems. If I am not giving money to Black Lives Matter, I am not a purposeful company, I'm hypocritical. But that's not the case, right? Your role is to focus on the social issues that you can move the needle most in. So you don't need to respond reactively to every problem in the world, but you should focus on the ones where you have comparative advantage and expertise in solving.
I think it's easy to say that though, but there's a lot of pressure, aren't there, on companies and every company now to have a stance on everything, don't you think, with social media? And it's like every company now has to have a an opinion or a stance or make a statement on all of these social issues. Otherwise, they're seen to not care. And I feel like social media has amplified that. We've seen that over the last year. Companies that didn't reply to Black Lives Matter movement, etc., were just inundated, both internally and externally, with from the employee saying, where do we stand on this? What's our stance?
I would say that actually then we should hold ourselves responsible for that, because if we are indeed holding companies responsible for public stances, then that could pressure companies into just doing things which are highly visible but are not actually changing the actual actions within the company. So this is the problem of greenwashing, where companies can say that they care about an issue but not actually put it into practice. It's easy to give money to charity or to post a black square. It's much harder for a company to say, we are taking diversity really seriously. And how we're going to do this is we're going to look at how we are hiring people and how we're promoting people, and whether our promotion and hiring processes are ones that are discriminatory against not just ethnic minorities, but against women or against people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so I think absolutely companies need to take diversity really seriously. Clearly, I'm someone who cares about this, but I don't necessarily think that we should hold companies accountable immediately for making public stances about it. Yes, you should certainly take it very seriously, but sometimes the optimal solution to this is not the short-term solution of, okay, let's give money to charity, but let me look at what are the areas of diversity which are particularly concerning to my company. And sometimes it's not even within the company, it might be customers. So with electronic arts, for example, they realise that in gaming, there's huge gender inequality in terms of the customer base. So given that their purpose is to encourage play for all, they're making concerted efforts to encourage gender diversity in the customer base. So if there is this issue of inclusion, I think just taking a little bit of time to focus on what is the actual issue that we can move the needle on most is, I think, the first step that a company should do.
Yeah, love that. Because we definitely see a lot of ticking the boxes in companies, right? But doesn't really have any long-term impact. So definitely, I love that advice of focusing on where you can have impact and make impact, which is aligned with your business as well. What do you think what's going to happen to companies you think that don't do this, that continue to lead with profit first? What is the impact going to be?
In the long term, they will become less successful. Why? Because if you are focused as profit being the end goal, there's going to be many investments that you're not going to take. Why? Because you could not see the impact on profit. And so even though in the short term there's not going to be a benefit, in the long term you're not going to be investing in your employees. There are going to be certain products that you didn't launch, even though they might have become profitable down the line, such as M-Pesa with Vodafone. There'll be certain things where you're not going to be investing in your suppliers. I guess it's similar to like a person. If you think sort of, not to get too philosophical, what is the meaning of life? Right? If you think the meaning of life is happiness, right, happiness is not something that you would pursue directly. Because if I pursued happiness directly, I would never exercise. I'd not do much work. I'd engage in a lot of selfish behavior. But if instead, sort of, I'm going to try and stretch myself and trying to look at challenging problems in my work and so on, then as a byproduct, then I will be hopefully more fulfilled and happy. So similarly within companies, yeah, profit is important. Like, companies are not charities. We need to make profits because investors will include savers and pension funds. However, I don't think profit is something that you should pursue directly, but instead you should see this as a byproduct of serving your purpose and serving wider society.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting as well during your work is when I think investors, I don't think many people do think about that includes pensions. It includes these other things, other when you think investors, for me personally, the first thing that didn't come to mind is people's pensions. So there's a lot more to meets the eye, right?
This is really important, right? Because we often think about, going back to the pie, it can be split between profits to investors and value to society. And we often think, well, this is them and us.
Exactly.
Investors are them. It's these nameless, faceless capitalists like hedge funds.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean.
And then society is customers and workers and communities, and that's what we are. But I think this is why I wanted to growing the pie idea, is it's not a them and us thing, because investors include us, right? Even private equity firms who invest in private equity it's often pension funds. And pension funds, they are going to be paying our retirement. Or it might be university endowments, so are investing in private equity, and they're going to fund future research and teaching. So ultimately, yes, indeed, some of these investors are institutions, but they're ultimately managing money on behalf of people. A couple of years ago, you might remember the university's pension fund was in a deficit, and a lot of university staff went on strike. Not me, but a lot of other professors went on strike, and this had huge repercussions, right? So there were students who were demanding teaching tuition fee reductions. Material had to be scrapped from exams because lectures were skipped. And so the failure to meet pensioners' savings is something which has huge implications. And if you think about inequality more generally, right, inequality is not only inequality in terms of the income that we receive, but also how we invest the income and how this grows in the future. And some of the biggest sources of wealth, particularly for the 99%, not the 1%, is the pensions that their employer is investing on their behalf. And so it's really important for companies to deliver returns to investors, which do include ordinary citizens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something that was an eye-opener for me, because I didn't think of investors as myself. I pay a pension, and I didn't even think of myself in that bucket as well. So super important. There's no us and them. So there's a very good distinction there. What advice would you give to leaders that listen to the show if that have already defined? So just to say that we've defined our purpose statement, we're very clear, very specific and focused. How do we now action that?
Yes. So I think that one of the steps was the measurement, as I mentioned, but I think, and then the third.
Sorry, after the measurement, yeah. Sorry.
After measurement, well, a third step would be ensure that purpose affects the decisions that the company makes. And how do you do that? Well, I know a large FTSE 100 company where the board will not let the chief executive or her top executive team put a proposal to the board unless they do not only a financial analysis, is it going to be profitable, but an analysis of how is this consistent with the firm's purpose.
Oh, great.
So this means that purpose should be scrutinizing all of our decisions. So if it's to open up a new revenue stream, is this a new revenue stream which is genuinely improving customer welfare, or are we selling products which are going to contribute towards obesity or addiction and so on? So I think it should be one where every major decision that's taken should be taken considering, is this something which is consistent with our purpose? And that could lead to some seemingly crazy decisions. So CVS, the US pharmacy, in around, I think, 2014, it renamed itself CVS Health.
Yeah.
Now, just changing your name is just greenwashing and PR, but they said, no, let's put it into practice. They said, let's stop selling cigarettes, even though cigarettes were $2 billion of sales at the time. So they stopped doing this. And then their total sales went up from, I think, $140 billion to $180 billion within a couple of years. So yes, they did lose in the cigarette sales, but they managed to get many other sales later on down the line, perhaps because customers realize, yeah, this company is truly purposeful. It's not just saying nice things, it's willing to make some financial sacrifices.
Mm-hmm. Also, I've seen there's been a big shift in both from our customers and employees that they want to buy from companies that have a clear purpose. And they also, obviously they're also giving back to society, and they also want to work for companies that align with their purpose. So I feel like it's becoming more important now than ever as well. Are you seeing that shift as well?
Yes, absolutely. I can see this even in the students that I teach. So I'm privileged in teaching at these business schools to teach MBA students who are some of the future leaders of this world. And if I was to talk about purpose in 2007, when I started as Professor Wharton, people just laugh at me. They would just laugh this out of the room as being just fluffy and an idealistic professor who has no knowledge about the real world and we need to make money. And yet now in 2021, it's huge. So I launched this new elective at London Business School on responsible business last year. And what was really gratifying is who was taking those courses. It wasn't people who wanted to go into CSR roles or SRI roles. There were people who wanted to go to mainstream jobs. So they wanted to work in, say, investment banking or investing. But they realized, well, in order to be a successful business, you need to be a purposeful business. And that course was massively oversubscribed. So it's we've now doubled the number of streams this year, and even that is still oversubscribed. So I do think that people do view purpose as important. And so if a company wants to attract top talent,
Yes.
right, they need to have a purpose. And I think that was true even before the pandemic. Why does the pandemic mean purpose matters even more? Is a lot of the work you're doing is from home. Now, this means that effort is much more discretionary. You don't have your boss checking, are you working hard? So I think purpose is even more important to make sure that employees will want to put in the discretionary effort rather than just doing the minimum that they can get away with.
Yeah, or you have the flashy office and facilities that kind of drive some of that, a little bit of that as well. You're completely right. What was one of the big surprises that you had what was the biggest surprise that you had during the research?
Yeah, so what was a big surprise was how ubiquitous it was. So one of my first studies, actually my own paper, which I wrote before the book, I started writing it in 2007, was on the link between employee satisfaction and long-term shareholder return. So basically, do companies do better if they treat their workers better? And before I did the study, I thought I would find that relationship in sort of the Googles of this world. So companies with high human capital, where there's a lot of sort of really in-demand employees, then you need to treat your workers well. But actually, when I first released the paper, the first company to approach me was McDonald's. And you might think, well, if there was a company which doesn't really need to treat their workers well, perhaps because there's more employee turnover, and so some people who work there might be working there while at school or university. No, but they realise, no, we need to treat our workers well because they are the public face of the company, and if they are surly or not positive about the business, then customers are going to notice it. So I thought that I would find that the effect was localized to a couple of companies, or a couple of industries, but actually I looked at both manufacturing and services, both high human capital and low human capital companies, but the effect was general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense as well. But I think most people would have the same assumption as you. It would be the Googles, the Facebooks, and a lot of these other organizations as well.
I'll say one other surprise, and this goes back to, and I'll do this because it picks up on your point, Chris, about investors. Now, there is this view that many people are arguing that in order to get companies to be more purposeful, we need to reduce what people call shareholder capitalism. So stop shareholders having a say in how companies are run, put workers on the board, or change the law that companies can ignore shareholders. But actually, this is not the case. So what the research surprisingly finds is that shareholder oversight, shareholder activism, indeed, in companies actually makes companies better off, not just in terms of profits, but how they treat society. So when hedge funds come into a company, not only does it become more profitable, but it becomes more innovative, it produces more patents, and labor productivity goes up. When private equity comes into a company, they find that injuries on the workplace goes down. When they buy restaurants, the restaurants become cleaner and healthier. They also look at IT investment goes up after private equity comes in, and this provides their workers with skills. So we love, again, to portray these investors as evil, Gordon Gekko capitalists who rob the house together and make tons of money at the expense of everyone.
But it's in their best interest as well.
Well, this is it. It's that it's in their best interest in the long term to have companies which are efficient, which have lower workplace injuries and are run clean restaurants. Because if not, right, they're not going to have customers and employees coming to them. So yeah, there might be one or two private equity investors who act in the pie-splitting way. But what was in the data was that if you look at large-scale data in aggregate, actually shareholder oversight is something which is very valuable. And I think this is very important in terms of changes in policy, because you have a lot of people who have jumped on the bandwagon of responsible business because it's a hot topic now. And any talking head, particularly a professor of economics or finance, can say stuff. And if you say stuff that sounds popularly good, like investors are evil, let's get rid of investor power, that gets a lot of support. But it's important too do the research, do the evidence. As I mentioned, I started researching this back in 2006. And so when I make statements, hopefully it's backed up by 15 years of research data, rather than me just jumping on the bandwagon because purpose is a popular thing and I want to jump on a popular issue.
Yeah, which is easy to do. Yeah. I'm noticing as well, one of the reasons why I was excited to speak to you is a lot of the chief HR officers and HR executives I speak to now also look after the CSR role in businesses. I'm seeing more and more HR executives take on that role. And I think it's super important because they're leading it from a people perspective first, as HR executives to do that. And a lot of what they do is obviously leading with purpose in organizations. So I think it's perfectly situated in organizations. In the companies that you've done research with, who's normally the catalyst of the person leading this change?
So it should actually be the board and the CEO. So I think it should be a CEO level issue. So in this talk, in this chat we've had, I've not really used the term CSR much. And why? Because CSR often has the connotation of being something that you can delegate to a CSR department.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking you. It should be a business. It should be the whole business, not just a department or a person leading
Absolutely.
it.
So I think the CEO needs to have ownership of purpose, because unless she believes that the purpose is something which will ultimately lead to the company's success, it will always be secondary to the finance people, right? So the CEO is going to listen more to the chief financial officer than she is to the head of CSR. So I think it needs to be owned by the CEO and also by the board. So there are some companies where purpose statements have been signed by the entire board. So EQT Ventures, you can look at their purpose statement, for example, and this means that the board has committed to making sure that they will evaluate the company's success, not just in financial terms, but also in purpose terms.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this recent study that the European Commission mandated, and that suggested that every board should have a chief purpose officer. I think that's a stupid idea. Sorry to use blunt language, but if you have a particular person who's a chief purpose officer, that again suggests it's siloed.
That's what I was getting. That's what I was getting at as well, because by defining that particular role, it becomes siloed as opposed to everyone. You know, it's like, we've got someone who deals with that. It shouldn't be like that. I agree.
Like everybody on the board should be a chief purpose officer. Like, you don't have a director who focuses on the financials and then another director who focuses. This is at the non-executive director level. You don't have a non-executive director who then focuses on the market positioning, right? You have the directors are there to monitor the company in general. Okay, you might have specialist committees for audit and remuneration, but for something as central as purpose, I think this should be owned by the entire board.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. What's the main feedback you get from people that have read the book?
So it is. This is obviously being selected, but it is positive. So I haven't, to my knowledge, had people saying, "Oh, this is something that is not. I don't agree with this, or it's inconsistent with my practical experience." So I think the bigger challenge that my book has is not so much negative feedback, but the lack of gung-ho positive feedback, because the book is rather balanced. Okay, so the book highlights the importance of purpose, but it also highlights that companies do need to be profitable and investors need to be taken care of because they play the support role of society. So had I written the book saying a company should ignore profit, just think about purpose and forget about their investors, it would probably have a lot of support by a certain certain audience.
Makes sense.
And if I wrote the other book saying, purpose is rubbish, companies should just only focus on investors, it would get support from the other end. Because it's sort of more middle and not really partisan, that does mean that I haven't had huge opposition to it. So I've not had, at least not to my knowledge, negative feedback, but if there was, they probably wouldn't be coming to me. But I think that the main challenge that I have is the lack of sort of because it's so non-partisan that you don't have particular groups supporting it, which is why, I'm really appreciative of opportunities like this to talk about the work, because it doesn't have a natural interest group wanting to get behind it. Well,
that's why I think it's so important, because we keep going back to before, there's no us and them. And I think that's one of the overarching things that were taken away from that. And it's not about half the pie; it's about the full pie, and us growing and benefiting together. as well. So I was more thinking about sort of the feedback you got on around the steps they would take after reading the book. In that sense, in terms of the feedback, the biggest takeaways that people have gotten from the book.
Yeah, so I think what they really like is the idea of purpose being something which is focused, because people typically thought purpose, if it just means altruism, then you're going to be pulled in every direction. So the whole idea of purpose still being consistent with taking commercial decisions is something that people like, is that I've tried to present purpose with a lens of understanding the commercial pressures that companies act with. I think some of the most gratifying things that I've heard from the book is from some large investment management firms which have said, we've made all of our investment team read the book. Some of them have said, we've sent the book to companies that we invest in, and we've asked the companies to implement the ideas of the book, or if not, explain why they don't want to do this. And I think this is key because, again, I think the important thing is not just to get companies on board, but to get investors on board. Because it could be that a company cares about purpose, but because if an investor thinks it's a load of rubbish, then the investor is going to sell their shares or vote to kick out the directors. So what has been really gratifying is the response, particularly from the investment community. And I think part of the reason might be because I don't position investors as nameless faceless capitalists. I see them as being partners in growing the pie, and therefore that perception has been positive.
Yeah.
And so that's why they are very willing, I think, to evaluate companies on more than just their short-term earnings, but look at these purpose dimensions as well.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. That's great news to hear. Well, I would love to get your thoughts on, we've seen some incredible changes and shifts happening in the investment landscape over the last 12 months, notably more recently with GameStop, the whole GameStop situation. I'd love to get your thoughts on that and seeing how people are using things like social media to what they call kind of stick up to the man and investors. I'm sure you know about the GameStop situation story. I'd love to I know it's completely off topic, but somewhat off topic, but I'd love to get your thoughts on it, given your background and experience.
Yeah, so the GameStop issue has obviously been a very interesting one, but I think it's rather orthogonal to purpose. I think it's driven by short-term issues, such as the possibility of giving a short squeeze. So I would say, yeah, that was an interesting story, but I say as a purposeful investor, that's something we shouldn't be too distracted by. I think what a purposeful company should be doing is taking large stakes. So a purposeful investor should be doing is taking large stakes to a company, trying to truly understand the company. So not just looking at the sustainability report of how many jobs it created or how many CO2 emissions it reduced, but trying to figure out, well, how is the company treating its workers? Well, I know one leading investor who asks most CEOs, how are your people? Tell me about their challenges and tell me what you're doing to address their concerns. And there's some CEOs who say, I didn't know that you were going to ask me about my people. Next time I bring along the HR director.
No.
And so that's really striking, because those are the CEOs who think, well, my people are so unimportant to me, I can delegate them to the HR director. So I'd say, a roundabout way to answer your question, I'd say these investors should not be concerned with sort of these short-term market swings and things like GameStop, even though it's sort of a pretty crazy story. To think about, let me understand the long-term fundamentals of the business. And again, an investor who's not short is not going to be concerned about short squeezes, so the GameStop issue doesn't really have any effect.
Yeah.
And your also goal is not to predict the next GameStop, which is going to have a short-term spike, because what you care about is long-term value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Well, look, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate your time. I'm super excited to finish. I haven't even managed. I'm halfway through, so I need to finish the rest. But for everyone listening, if there's a parting piece of advice you could give to everyone, what would that be? And then where's the best place for people to connect with you and also grab a copy of the book?
Thanks. I'd say purpose is critical for the long-term success of a business. So for a long time, people have thought there's a moral case for business. We're going to do this because companies need to serve wider society. But I'd like to say there's a business case for purpose. Yes, the moral case is important, but even if you're a hard-headed businessman or businesswoman who thinks I need to make my company successful, I'd say purpose is a way of doing this for the reasons you mentioned, Chris. Employees and customers are really assessing and scrutinizing how purposeful a company is, and also purpose can unleash these new investment opportunities like Vodafone and M-Pesa that would have otherwise been off your radar screen. The book is called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, and you can get it at Amazon or any other places. But what I've also got on my website, which is growthepie.net, is other free articles about these topics. So there have been developments in responsible business that have happened after I finished the book, and so I've written a few blog posts on those articles, so to keep people in touch with the recent developments. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn, so I'll also try and post stuff about responsible business on those forums.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for joining us. And for everyone listening, those links are already in the LinkedIn chat. So if you're listening on if you're on LinkedIn Live right now, they're in the chat. If you're listening to the podcast, they'll be in the description. So we make your life a bit easier. So make sure you go and connect. Apart from that, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And I wish you all the best, and hopefully we get to meet in person soon. So that would be nice.
I love that too, Chris. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me.
No problem. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.